I find this to be extremely interesting, and so I had to bring it to your attention. There was a recent interview about the Switch 2 with some indie developers, and they've made a game for the Switch, Spirit of the North. These were the co-founders of the studio, Infuse Studio, and they were talking about how long the Switch 2 will be in its strength. Now, what I mean by that is the Switch 2 is expected to come out and have pretty powerful graphics, especially for a portable system. They're saying that the performance should be comparable to an Xbox Series S, and then with DLSS and, algorithmic upgrading, it could look even better. But how long will that actually count as in its strength, right? Because Nintendo is chronically known for releasing consoles mid-generation where they are okay for a bit and then they fall off and become what some would call bad in terms of their performance and graphical capabilities. Now, the Switch 2 looks to leverage this a little bit heavier than other Nintendo consoles, it seems, based on what we know, based on the chips, based on the expected specs, based on the leaks, that the Switch 2 is actually going to be very competitive, that it's going to be able to get many multi-platform games, rather. And these two gentlemen from the Spirit of the North studio, they agree. They say that they think it's going to get a bunch of really good multi-platform games early on. But they bring up the interesting discussion that because it's being thrown out in the middle of a generation, eventually its specs are not going to be high enough for smooth porting once the next generation systems from Sony and Microsoft are out. So this, I think, is just a very interesting debate of how long will the Switch 2 be super great. Now, for us, the Switch 1 has been super great its whole life cycle, right? Like, it's fine right now. We still can play a bunch of awesome games, and the performance is maybe a bit underwhelming, but it's not something that totally ruins the system or is a detractor. But for people who may be looking to buy a system, they look at the Switch, they look at the PS5, and it's like, yo, this is way too bad. I can't deal with this. The graphical gap is huge. So we know that the PlayStation 6 is expected to come out in late 2027 or 2028. And that's not just me hypothesizing. That is based on court documents when Microsoft was acquiring Activision Blizzard, and they were kind of giving information that the PS6 is likely to debut in holiday 2027 or holiday 2028. Xbox is experiencing all sorts of problems, and they could opt to push for a next generation console even quicker, whether that's a handheld, whether that's a home console, whether that's both. We know that there's going to be a PS5 Pro launching later this year, but I don't really count that. We know that the audience for these half steps is smaller, and we know that the graphical gain will be, notable, but not insurmountable for the Switch 2, in my opinion. So I think that you have, let's say the Switch 2 comes out in 2025. I think you have all of 2025 and all of 2026, and then 2027 is where things get interesting. Now, this sounds crazy because, gosh, that would only be 2 full years. If you recall, the Nintendo Switch had like 3.5 years. It released in 2017, and then we had 2018, 2019, and then 2020 was when the new PS5 and Xbox Series consoles debuted. It is possible that because of the longevity of the Switch 2 actually has less time in the sun. And this is where a very delicate balancing act is going to be important for Nintendo. We know that they don't prioritize graphics as their number one item on the agenda. We know that they want to keep the system cost down. We know that they focus on how can they support their developers to make the best darn games possible without pushing the envelope in a way that increases the postage. Basically, how can we keep the Switch to $400 or less? I'm sure that's what they're trying to do. I don't think they want a $450 system. But is it in their best interest to try and target a little bit higher so that the Switch 2 maintains relevance for longer? Thankfully, due to the Switch 1's extreme success and Nintendo's position of power in the industry, their ability to lure third-party developers, their ability to lure indies, and now their ability to lure first-party developers like Sony and Microsoft, I don't know that they care. But where this could become problematic is how we feel about it. So it's going to be very exciting to have a Nintendo system that feels quite powerful. And I think the big difference here is employing the DLSS type technology is going to be a bigger benefit than where the Switch was when it started. I think the starting line for the Switch 2 is significantly above where the Switch 1 starting line was, even in relation to the other consoles. The Switch 2 was not impressive, or the Switch 1 was not impressive when it came out, but I think the Switch 2 will be impressive when it comes out. And the Switch 1 kind of only got worse and worse as time went on. Nobody was getting that and saying, wow, these graphics are incredible. They were saying like, okay, this works for a portable console. This works for, it's all right. And now some people say, oh my gosh, it's too bad. And some people say, okay, like if the developers really puts the time and the oomph and the money in, they can make a Switch game that looks good. I don't think that the Switch 2 is going to suffer because of this short gap it has kind of at the top of the heap. But I do wonder how long it'll be able to establish third-party parity in terms of releases, not obviously graphics. Can Nintendo make enough gains in the first 2 years of Switch 2 so that they ensure themselves they get ports for a long time? Now, Microsoft might be the secret crux of this entire thing, because right now, what is helping Nintendo out is the Xbox Series S. Why? Because developers have to develop for the Xbox Series S, and then they scale from there. If the Switch is around an Xbox Series S, boom, we're in business. Now all of these developers that are making their games to work on an Xbox Series S will also work on a Switch 2, and it shouldn't be that difficult. It shouldn't be that much of a downgrade. It shouldn't be a feature limiter. If Microsoft is able to, A, stay competitive, because there's a world where they can't, but if they're able to stay competitive and continue to make consoles, do they decide to go along with the tiered console release for their next console? Is there the equivalent of the Series S in the next generation that can sort of be the link between the Switch 2 and the PS6 Xbox Series X2? Is there going to be a lower end model that developers and publishers have to target, and therefore it makes the Switch an easier inclusion? You basically got one of two paths for Nintendo to establish and maintain third-party support. Either the Switch 2 is so darn successful that they can't ignore it, although I will say they ignored the Switch in many ways, but like I said, the Switch 2 does have a stronger baseline. So I think it'll be harder for developers to just write it off, and on the contrary, I think it'll be easier for developers to continue to include it in their plans, and that will please investors and executives supremely, saying, hey, there's 20 million Switch 2s out there, we can sell to that audience as well. They've got that going for them, and then they've got, if Microsoft or Sony, I guess, but most likely Microsoft, if they continue this tiered system with a lower SKU and a higher SKU, that will be huge for Nintendo. But I do wonder if, given the higher baseline and if given the DLSS capabilities, if this may not be anywhere near as much of an issue as we expect it to be. Will it be a case where, okay, because of that, they're able to achieve and, quote unquote, fake the performance of a more powerful system long enough to support these next-gen consoles and next-gen games? Because I think the most disappointing thing for a Switch fan, to me this is more disappointing than not having third-party support at all, is to get great third-party support the first 2 years. Like, we're like, oh, the new Assassin's Creed, the new Call of Duty, this is amazing. And then 2027 rolls around, new consoles drop, and everything just comes to a halt. We've seen many Nintendo third-party games, but many of them have been ports of older titles, collections of nostalgic games, franchises that have not been featured on Nintendo anymore. I think that ace in the hole is gone. I don't think it's an ace. I think it's more like an 8. I don't think you can release a Dead Space collection on the Switch 2 and still have it be as impactful as releasing the BioShock games on Switch 1. I think you're going to have to do parity, multi-platform releases day and date on Switch 2 if you want to get that third-party shine. And it's going to be very interesting to see if this DLSS concept is enough to push the Switch 2 for longer than 2 years, or if we're going to run into a hard stop once again. Nintendo may have taken this into account. Furukawa does seem very smart, and he's definitely very concerned with the transitional capabilities of this next system. Can it move effortlessly to the next generation? Not just, I think, for Nintendo accounts, Nintendo Online players, but also with this in mind, knowing that they are off kilter, right? Off schedule. They're not on the same yearly timetable as PlayStation and Microsoft. They have to be cognizant of this, and I think it's something that they were not cognizant of enough in past generations, and I do think it bit them. Even if it did not doom the Switch, maybe it limited the Switch, Or maybe the Switch is such a wonderkind it wasn't going to be limited by anything. But I hope that Furukawa & Co. have been very aware of what could happen if your system is run out of the graphical games by newer systems because you chose to release not only mid-cycle, but in a way late. It doesn't feel like it because it feels like next gen just started since we stopped getting cross-gen games finally. But the Switch existing for 8 years, that really does put it long into the next/current gen, and it gives the Switch 2 even less time to get going, to build momentum before maybe there's something else out. So let me know what you think in the comments down below. How do you feel about this occurring? And will Nintendo be able to start off strong enough and utilize the technology that they've implemented to avoid a 2-year collapse where PS6 and Xbox Series X2 end up dooming the multi-platform third-party support of the Switch 2? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments down below. I think Nintendo can do it. In the meantime, stay safe, stay healthy, stay happy, stay positive out there. Love y'all lots. SwitchForce out.